Hi, my name is Akshay Agarwal. I'm a graduate student in Professor Karl Berggren's group at MIT. And today I'll be talking about some of the work that we've been doing in developing a nanofabricated electron interferometer using focused ion beam technology. This work was done in collaboration with Dr. Dirk van Dijk from the University of Antwerp in Belgium, and it was funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So let me start off by talking a little bit about interferometry in general and amplitude division interferometry in particular. So in any kind of interferometry, the basic aim is to take the beam, it could be an electron beam or a photon beam, and divide it into two or more components, and then recombine those components with one another to obtain interference. So what we do is we start off with an incident beam of electrons, and we place a diffraction grating in the path of this beam. This diffraction grating is just a thin piece of crystal for us. What the grating does is it diffracts the beam into several orders, and here I'm only showing the first three orders, but of course there will be many more. Now, if we place a second crystal below the first, and the second crystal is perfectly well aligned with the first crystal, then each of these beams will again diffract off the second crystal, because each of these beams will still be at a Bragg angle with respect to the second crystal. And so you can now see that some of these beams will start overlapping and interfering with one another. In this figure here, for example, the blue beam and the yellow beam will start interfering with one another. And so if we move into this interference region, we would expect to see fringes. Now we can image these fringes either directly by placing a screen in that plane, or we can read them out by placing a third grating. Now the advantage of amplitude division interferometry of this type, where we take the beam and split its amplitude into two and recombine those two beams, over current electron interferometry, which uses wavefront division, in which you use a biprism to split the wavefront of the electron beam and then recombine those two waves with one another, is that in wavefront division interferometry, you necessarily need a very high coherence source. So you have to use a field emission gun, whereas amplitude division interferometry could potentially be done with a very low coherence source. So you could use a thermal emission guns, and we can envision doing interferometry not just in field emission electron microscopes, but in any old electron microscope. So that has been one of the motivating factors for this work. So amplitude division interferometers have been around for a long time. In fact, the very first electron interferometer, which was developed way back in 1954 by Martin and co-workers, was an amplitude division interferometer. More recently, Groninger and co-workers also developed an amplitude division interferometer for electrons using nanofabricated gratings. Both of these interferometers, the major challenge that they had to overcome was alignment. So for example, Martin and co-workers, they developed a very specially designed stage on which they mounted each of their gratings, and they could translate and rotate these gratings, and that's how they obtained alignment. Groninger and co-workers, they used an external laser interferometer to align their electron interferometer. And the reason why they were so worried and we are so worried about alignment is because if these crystals are misaligned with each other, the diffracted beams might go off in different directions, and then we won't get overlap. So if we take a step to the other side of the fence to atom and neutron interferometers, they don't face this issue. They don't have to worry about doing anything external to align their gratings. The reason for this is that they don't make their gratings separately and then try to combine them in an interferometer. What they do is they take one chunk of crystal and cut out three gratings from that chunk. And because these crystals or these gratings are all derived from one big chunk of single crystal, they are automatically aligned with one another. And you don't need to do anything special to align them. So what we wanted to do was take this idea of self-aligned gratings, combine that with the idea of nanofabrication, and implement an interferometer in a TEM. And focused ion beam milling has really enabled us to do this. So let me now quickly go through the fabrication procedure that we use for our gratings. We start off with these commercially available TEM grids that have single crystalline silicon cantilevers. So in the image to the top left, you can see these gratings and then a zoom into one of these cantilevers. These cantilevers have many different thicknesses and geometries, which enable us to play around with the geometry of our three gratings, of our multi-grating structures. The first thing we do is go into one of these cantilevers, and as you can see in the schematic to the top left, we use a 30 kilovolt gallium ion beam to mill a window all the way through the cantilever. You can see an image of that window in the SEM image on the right. This window acts as a milling stop for future steps, and it also defines the active area of our gratings. In the next step, we rotate the TEM grid containing the cantilevers by 90 degrees, and first deposit platinum on two regions of the cantilever. Now these two regions define where we want our gratings to be. And the next step is to again use a 30 kilovolt gallium ion beam to mill away the silicon between these platinum deposits. So now we've defined exactly our gratings. The last step is to reduce the energy from 30 kilovolts to about 2 to 5 kilovolts, and also reduce the current to polish these gratings down to a thickness of about 40 to 50 nanometers or so. And finally, we get two thin crystalline gratings separated by, in this experiment, about 20 microns. And again, because they're derived from one chunk of single crystalline silicon, they are automatically aligned with one another. And also, because they're all on a TEM grid, we can directly take this interferometer and insert that into any old TEM. In our experiments, we use a Joule 2010F. All right, so when we do insert it into a TEM, what would we expect to see? Well, here's a simulation of electron diffraction from such a two-grating structure. And the gratings in this simulation are separated by about 20 microns. And the beam parameters that we used, a beam diameter of about 240 nanometers and a beam convergence angle of about 4 millirads, is about the same that we did in our experiments as well. So you can again see the primary beam getting diffracted from the first crystal or the first grating, and then each of these beams gets diffracted again from the second. And I've just marked out in black here the beams that are of interest to us and that form the interferometer. And so you can again see that about 20 microns below the second grating, the beams interfere with one another, and I'm calling that plane where they interfere, the interference plane. So if I start imaging on the second grating, if I place my TEM image plane on the second grating, I would expect to see multiple spots because of diffraction from the first grating. So I would expect to see multiple beams on the second grating. If I start moving my imaging plane below the second grating, I would expect to see more spots arise because of diffraction now from the second grating. So in addition to the spots from the first grating, I would now expect to see more spots from the second. In blue here, I'm marking out the first order diffracted beam from the second grating. And you can see that it's moving towards the yellow beam, which is the first order diffracted beam from the first grating. Ultimately, about 20 microns below the second grating in the interference plane, these two beams overlap with each other and interfere. And so this is how we would expect to see these this interference pattern form and these beams to evolve as they propagate through our interferometers. And I would like to mention that this simulation is based on work that was done by Alexander Cronin and Ben McMorran back in 2008. All right, so we take our TEM grid and we insert that into a Joule 2010F. And this is the image that we get on the second grating. So z equal to 0 corresponds to the first grating, 20 corresponds to the second. And you can see the 0 order beam in the center and the two first order beams on the left and the right. We can zoom into the 0 order beam and get a very nice lattice resolved image. The separation between the 111 planes is about 3.2 angstroms, as you would expect to see. We now start moving our TEM imaging plane below the second grating, and you can tune the imaging plane either by tuning the objective lens current or by physically moving the stage so that different planes below the second grating are in the imaging plane. And as we do this, we see additional spots emerge because of diffraction from the second grating. So here in blue, I'm marking out the first order diffracted beam from the second grating. And at about 30 microns, which is midway from the interference plane to the second grating, the first order beam is about midway between the 0 order and the first order beam from the first grating, as you would expect. As we continue moving down, the two beams eventually merge with each other, and we can take a high resolution image of this merged spot, zoom in a bit more, and finally we see very well resolved interference fringes, and the period of these fringes is about 3.2 angstroms, which is what we would expect to see from interference between 000 and 111 silicon diffracted beams. From the contrast of these fringes, we can also estimate the spatial coherence of the electron beam, and in our experiment it turned out to be about 15 to 20%, which is in agreement with previous studies. And we also did other characterization and diffraction experiments with these interferometers, and you can find details in this paper here. All right, so we have demonstrated a two grating separated path electron interferometer, and the interferometer is self-aligned. We don't need to do anything special to align the gratings with one another. The next step we want to take is to place a third grating below the second grating to obtain a full Mach-Zehnder geometry. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to use our three grating structures to perform this really nice experiment which was proposed by Elitzer and Weidman back in '93, which is called interaction-free imaging. The idea here is to place an object in one of the arms of a Mach-Zehnder interferometer. So I'm showing that schematically in the image to the right. And we can potentially image this object with reduced damage as compared to classical microscopy. And in fact, Kruitt and co-workers early this year came up with quite a few schemes in which interaction-free imaging could be implemented practically in this paper from ultramicroscopy. All right, so that's about it. I'd like to thank all the scientists and researchers at the University of Antwerp who helped me in fabricating and characterizing these gratings. And I'd again like to acknowledge the funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Thank you.